After spending the better part of an entire week in some change, having earned all 50 achievements with the PC version, I must protest that Dragon Ball Sparking Zero has not lived up to expectations. To be blunt, the game, while not bad, is far from great, and it leaves much to be desired. In fact, there's really three things that I could give developer Spike Chunsoft credit for. Three things all on one hand. The first is obviously the graphics. The graphical prowess of Dragon Ball Sparking Zero is off the charts insane. The characters appear very close in proximity with the art style of the anime itself, in a way that no other Dragon Ball game before it has come even remotely close by comparison. It also helps that the explosions from Ki Beam attacks are radiant and they're nicely illuminated. The second pro I'm going to praise the developers for is the roster itself. Its size alone is enough to satisfy any competent Dragon Ball fan, and I certainly don't recall any fighting game having this many characters just in general. But before I get ahead of myself, I'll just save that point for later. The last pro I'll give the developers credit for is the fluidity of the fighting system. It's very responsive most of the time, and it's practical. Now, hopefully those watching this take aren't snowflakes who can't seem to handle fair, critical talking points, because that's the best that I can do. Literally everything else about Dragon Ball Sparking Zero is a complete waste. It doesn't matter which segment of the game you're referring to, whether it's the offline single-player content or the online PvP content. It's bare bones as bare bones gets. However, what's most disturbing is that Bandai Namco greenlit and released a modern Dragon Ball fighting game with less offline content than Xenoverse 2 or arguably even Fighter Z, which has a more robust story mode than what Sparking Zero has to offer. The main component of the single-player content in this game is this episode battle, which sits as the top option within one of the tabs in the main menu. As soon as you pull this thing up, it becomes clear just how scatterbrained the mode really is. The concept of episode battle is to allow the player to experience the story of Dragon Ball Z and Dragon Ball Super through the eyes of one specific character, ignoring everyone else around that character. But the selection is rather limited to just a few names. These would include Goku, Vegeta, Trunks, Piccolo, and Gohan. Some of the villains get their own version, and those consist of Frieza, Goku Black, and Jiren. Everyone else has been omitted. Characters like Gotenks, Vegito, Cell, Majin Buu, and others are completely ignored. This ultimately leaves several important battles within the series on the cutting room floor to be skipped over, leaving in question just what the purpose was behind this so-called story mode, or even the question of just how much effort was put into this mode to begin with. To make matters worse, Episode Battle has these ridiculous difficulty spikes that just arise out of nowhere. The game doesn't know how to present the player with an appropriate challenge. The difficulty is either set to 0 or it's on 100. There is no middle option. You can either lower the difficulty or you can set it to default. The problem is that the default option is simply too difficult for its own good, especially if you're a new player who's never experienced the Tenkaichi games before. Even as someone who's been with the series since the very first game came out back in the mid-2000s, I had some significant trouble playing certain chapters. The one that comes to mind the most isn't the Great 8 Vegeta chapter that everyone was complaining about at one point, which comes very early on in the mode itself, but a much worse chapter when it comes to the sporadic difficulty spikes would be from Goku Black's chapter playing as a melting version of Zamasu against Vegito. In this chapter, the computer playing as Vegito has been programmed to counter literally everything, and unless you have a firm grasp of the game's defensive mechanics, which I'll get to the problem with those in a moment, or if you just spam sparking mode, which I'll get to that in a moment as well, it's likely that you will teeter the edge of pulling your hair out in exhaustion from the difficulty, and pure frustration. This is where the game developers should and need to be called out on this. This is why most video games have multiple options when it comes to difficulty. You don't just offer two difficulty settings in a video game, with the lower one being 0 and the default option being 100. That's not how to responsibly present a challenge to a player base. In 2024, design like this is just stupid. Pure stupidity and ignorance on the behalf of those working at Spike Chunsoft, and especially pure stupidity and ignorance on the behalf of their publisher, Bandai Namco, who should know better than to release something like this. A greater problem with Episode Battle, besides the fact that it skips over large portions of the original story at random and the absurd difficulty spikes, would be the actual layout of the mode. I'll get to the problem with the visual aspect of it in a bit, as that's one of the main problems with it, but one issue I notice is how the game gives the player access to what's easily the most important pieces of content in the mode, which are these what-if scenarios, called sparking episodes. First, to even access these sparking episodes, the game will lock the player from being able to play them if they've lowered the difficulty, meaning they're locked to the default difficulty option, which brings up the previous point regarding the problem with the game's approach to difficulty. You can use an item known as a dragon orb to lower the requirement of a secondary objective needed for a what-if scenario, but I honestly never paid attention to the system and never knew that this even existed throughout my time with the game. I saw the term Dragon Orb on screen, but didn't know what it was used for, so naturally I never used it. In order to unlock the what-if scenarios, or sparking episodes, the fast way, the most reliable approach is to simply complete the objectives of certain chapters to unlock new paths on the map. From what I've noticed, most of these revolve around beating the AI as fast as possible within an invisible time constraint. Others actually force you to lose against the AI, which is a first I've seen in a fighting game. And then there's one in Vegeta's chapter that forces you to play another chapter and beat that chapter within the invisible time limit in order to unlock a dialogue option needed to access yet another sparking episode. The whole thing is just a fucking mess of haphazard game design with virtually no deep thought put into it. And it's ultimately not fun, not even because of the issues that I just went over, but just navigating the fucking mode itself is a pain in the ass. This thing is set up so stupid with these character maps that move at the speed of a snail that it boggles the mind that the developers would do some dumb shit like this. And it's clear that they knew this was a problem, which is why they put this warp option in the UI so the player can just jump to the node that they want at any given point they want. It's very clear that this should have just been a normal menu, whether it be presented in the form of a top-down list or even a scrolling horizontal form. That would have been better than this crap we have here, where each character has their own so-called map that has lines going in and out in whichever direction. I mean, this is what Spike Chunsoft was working on for over a year leading up to release, is this garbage lazy excuse of a story mode where they present the player with a bunch of slideshows with the rare occasional cutscene thrown in. This has to be a joke, right? And it gets worse. The UI isn't just a problem in Episode Battle, but it's a problem in every menu of the game. This game is filled with these needlessly complicated visual set pieces of a menu, as if this is a Star Wars DVD from 2005, where every screen has to be this canvas of multiple characters with a fancy animation playing before the player can even access the damn option they want to go to. It's so stupid, like, what the hell were they thinking? There's also lag in every menu in the game as well, so even if you want to do something simple like check your player card, for example, you have to go to the specific tab to check it, and there's a brief second delay because you have to watch the animation play out on that tab before you can go to the option you want. I haven't even gotten to the other so-called offline content in here just yet, but already with what has been discussed, this is a very, very lazy, conceited effort on the behalf of the dev team at Chun Spikesoft. But it gets worse. Besides Episode Battle, the player only has 3 other options for offline content, one of them being the normal versus mode with the CPU, and that obviously doesn't count. So really, you only have 2. The first is divided into 2 options with Custom Battle, and the second is Tournament Mode. When I say that these 2 half-ass modes are lazy, it's not a jest. These are lazy to the point of being insulting. Tournament Mode is a goddamn joke, with only a measly 3 matches per tournament, despite the fact that there's 6 different variants. And Custom Battle is just as bad. The mode is split between Custom Battle Mode and Bonus Battles, which are developer pre-made versions of what Custom Battle Mode offers. All Custom Battle offers is a mode where the player can create their own what-if scenarios and upload them online for other people to play. The game gives you numerous dialogue options to sort through to create these battles, and you can customize your own thumbnail to them. The problem is that the dialogue options are rather limited, and none of them are voiced by the actors, leaving a very unprofessional feel to them. Not only that, but the what-if scenario thing is lazy within of itself. Instead of getting creative and telling a more original story, which is what Dragon Ball FighterZ did to great effect, and Xenoverse 2 did on a less creative scale but was still interesting, the devs here focused only on boring, effortless rehashes of the story from the show, while occasionally throwing the audience a bone in the form of these what-if scenarios, which in Sparking Zero is used purely to reach a zombie mainstream audience in the most trite way possible. That's your single-player content in Dragon Ball Sparking Zero, a poor effort from a team who clearly couldn't care less about delivering a satisfying game with substantial offline content. And if the offline content is this poor, then surely the online content is better by comparison, because it's clear that this game was intended mainly for online play in mind. However, that's not the case. The online content offerings are just as bad, just as weak as the offline stuff. In online, the only thing you can do is play either player matches or ranked. Most will gravitate to the latter over the former. And in matchmaking, you can either choose a DP battle consisting of a team of characters for up to 5, or you can choose a single battle where both participants can only play as one character the entire match. The problem with single battle highlights a serious issue with this game from a competitive standpoint, in that certain characters are automatically useless because the game, like the older Tenkaichi games, were developed with lore accurate power levels in mind. This makes playing as weaker characters like Hercule or Videl against the majority of the character roster impossible. These characters have smaller health pools, and their attacks are ineffective unless the player spams key attack moves over and over throughout the match. Therefore, the only real viable option to playing online in this game is with DP Battle. Still, there are issues with that option as well. To prevent a problem where the fanbase will only pick the strongest Dragon Ball characters and ignore everyone else, the devs at Spike decided to implement this strange point system. Each character is assigned a number of DP, or destruction points. The stronger the character is, the more DP costs they expend. The player can only have up to 15 total DP. That number is problematic because it locks the more powerful characters in the game to around 2 slots per team simply because of their DP costs. So if you want to use a character like Ultra Instinct Goku, who costs between 8 to 9 DP, then you can't pair Ultra Instinct Goku with a team of more than 3 characters. The execution of this system is dodgy because they limit how many characters you can even have on your team to the point where the game defeats the purpose of the mode's concept. Having only 15 DP to work with is the problem, and all they have to do to fix it is simply raise the number to 20. If they did that, then it would be possible to include up to 5 characters on your team without having to resort to the weakest characters in the game. But that's not the only issue with Sparking Zero's online multiplayer. As a competitive fighting game, the Dragon Ball franchise has always had problems, especially with the more recent entries. Xenoverse 2 is a mediocre fighting game whose entire system hinges off this stupid stamina bar that each player has, which is the only viable way to defend against attacks. Once that bar is depleted, you're left wide open, very similar to the Naruto Storm games with the substitution system. This isn't a good competitive experience online simply for that reason. Fighter Z is a competent fighting game, but it's also equally terrible to play online because of the lack of defensive options given to the player. You only have a knockback animation that's very clunky to use in practice given how fast the game plays. You have a vanish that's not reliable as a defensive option, whose actual purpose is to chain together combos as an extender. The only way to play this game competitively is to wait on your side of the screen for the other person to make a move and attempt to counter what they do, or you could bum rush them and hope that they're not skilled enough to counter whatever offensive capabilities you have. Once you're trapped in a combo, there's nothing you can do unless the other person makes a mistake. This is because the entire game, along with every character in it, has been designed around the concept of the rushdown character, a character that's designed to pressure their opponent with offense 24/7. It is nothing but rushdown with Fighter Z, and the game doesn't accommodate any other playstyles. In comparison to these two games, Sparking Zero competitively has a different problem. This game has too many defensive options, and they each can be abused because there's no limit placed on virtually all of them except 2. All of the game's mechanics are explained in the explanation of controls in the pause menu, as well as the battle training mode with Piccolo. The menu counter technique explains that there's 5 different counters, and when you add the normal block mechanic, which you can also set that to be used as a default option, where your character will automatically block certain attacks without your input, you have upwards of 6 different defensive options. The counters specifically get closer to the real problem with this game being a valid online competitive experience. Revenge counter is the best of the bunch because it's limited to a player's skill counter, which are stocks, numbers under the character portrait for each player. And even then, it won't work unless you have at least 2 stocks. The problem is that it's limited only to situations where your opponent is in front of you, and it will not work if they're behind you. High-speed evasion allows you to vanish behind your opponent for a follow-up counter. The problem with it is that there should be a limit on it. If you have 2 players that are good at using this mechanic, since it's only a matter of getting the timing right, then you have bullshit like this where it's this boring back and forth, until someone either makes a mistake or concedes. Super counter, which is arguably the most clunky mechanic to use, will allow a knockback counter if you time it with your opponent's attacks. The problem here is that it's unnecessary because you can also simply vanish behind your opponent with high-speed evasion for a follow-up attack, which is far more effective in an online fight. You have perception and super perception, both of which work as long as you hold down one of the face buttons, and the game will automatically select the appropriate counter based on the type of attack your opponent throws at you. This mechanic essentially sets the game to autoplay. The only difference between the two is that normal perception will counter only rush attacks and uses no stocks. Super perception will counter more than just rush attacks and will even counter energy beam attacks, but it uses 1 stock. Finally, you have Z counter, which is specific to follow-up attacks. It's basically just high-speed evasion, but with follow-ups. Why they gave it a different name and called it something else is beyond me. Most fighting games have an issue with limiting defensive options to the player. However, Sparking Zero has the opposite problem by giving the player too many options and thereby giving all players too many free get-out-of-jail cards. Sparking Zero, as a result, basically plays itself when it comes to the defensive options here, especially when you consider that Perception and Guard are interchangeable to where both can be used almost simultaneously. The game allows the player to guard and then use Perception as their guarding to knock back their opponent and force a withdrawal of their key at the same time. By giving the player too many defensive options, the devs have given essentially a list to go through one by one until one works. If Perception doesn't work, then let's try high-speed evasion or super counter, and if that doesn't work, then I'll still have revenge counter to fall back on. It makes the game too easy to play and puts the gameplay on autopilot. But when the game itself was designed with fanservice first in mind and making everything look as flashy as possible, one has to question what's the purpose of even having things like a useless ranking system and leaderboards in the first place. That's not the only issue with online, but of course, like many other fighting games, certain characters are beyond broken. Android 20 has a grapple move that allows him to absorb health, meaning anyone who uses Android 20 will likely attempt to spam grapples the entire match. Any transformation into a fusion character in the game will result in the game fully refunding the performing player's health back to them, creating a highly unfair advantage to their opponent. Yajirobe has a move that allows him to use a Sensu Bean and restore his health to full capacity if he has 5 stocks to use it. When you combine that with the fact that he only costs 2 DP for team battles, this makes Yajirobe the most broken character in the entire game. Videl has a rush skill that uses only 2 bars of ki, meaning the player can abuse it by using the move, charging their ki when their opponent is down, and then using it again before they can recover. If the counter options aren't triggering because this game has a responsiveness problem to certain things at random, then there's nothing you can do. I've quit out of numerous matches because of shit like this. Because of players taking advantage of poor gameplay on the behalf of Spike Chunsoft, and unless these things are nerfed, it's impossible to take Sparking Zero seriously as a competent competitive online experience. That's not to mention that this game lacks a lobby option to where you can see other players in a list, but then again, that's been abused before in other games where players will deliberately avoid certain players based on stupid shit like their level of connection or if they quit out of matches consistently. So I'll give the game somewhat of a pass there. If there's anything else I would jump on this game for, it's the mediocre stage selection that has multiple stages that are missing. There's no stage representing anything that took place in Dragon Ball GT, despite the inclusion of those characters. There's no stage representing anything that took place in the Dragon Ball Z movies, whether it's Fusion Reborn, Super Android 13, Cooler's Revenge, The Tree of Might, Broly the Legendary Super Saiyan, the list goes on. There's stages that they took out from the older Tenkaichi games. There's no stage where you're in outer space. The Antarctic ice stage is missing. The long road stage where Vegeta fights Android 18 from the show is missing. It just seems very rushed and thrown together. Again, haphazardly. And a lot of these stages made it into Xenoverse 2. So I'm very baffled and confused as to why they didn't make it in Sparking Zero. If there's a word to describe Sparking Zero, it's lazy. This game is lazy. The content offerings with the offline content is lazy. The content offerings with the online content is lazy. There's no time attack mode. There's no survival mode. There are no mini games. There are multiple missing stages. Episode battle sucks ass. Tournament mode sucks ass. Custom battle mode sucks ass. None of these modes offer any genuine longevity outside the achievement list or even with it. It's all a half-ass effort where the bulk of the budget went into the character roster, which is further backed up by virtually every marketing trailer that this game received leading up to release. The way this game turned out actually makes me even more concerned for the upcoming Bleach Rebirth of Souls game, which seems to be making the same exact mistake, hinging all of its marketing on which characters from that series are going to make it in as playable characters. I'm rather baffled that Bandai Namco figured that this game was acceptable for mass market release, especially when other recent Dragon Ball games have offered more content by comparison. And unless there's going to be a wide array of post-launch support that's not just in the form of adding more characters, but also adding more stages and gameplay modes, this game will die a slow death for anyone who doesn't care about online leaderboards. Right now, the game that this compares to the most from another franchise would be Naruto Storm 4, which has a much better story mode with viable replayability thanks to fun boss encounters and clever performance metrics. Storm 4 also has other offline gameplay modes, including a free roam mode. Sparking Zero has none of that. It's a one-and-done game, especially for those who aren't big fans of the franchise, which is anyone who's not a millennial. This game was not made for the Gen Z generation, since Dragon Ball's popularity came and went before that generation came into prominence. At the end of the day, this game isn't bad, but it's not good either. It's a mediocre half-ass effort that could have and should have been better than what it ultimately turned out to be, and it stands as one of the year's biggest disappointments, by objective fact. Thankfully, the Silent Hill 2 remake has saved October from being a complete waste of time. But if this is the level of quality that we can expect from Dragon Ball games going forward, then there's not much of anything to look forward to.
Die, trash! You'll live a peaceful life as one of the Tuffle race, thanks to my parasitic eggs.